I'll be reading from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, as we carry on in our series we've begun in 1 Peter. So this is the word of the Lord. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy as I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. For all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever. And this word is the good news that was preached to you. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. So Peter largely writes this letter to equip Christians to stand in a time of persecution. Every chapter in this epistle takes on, in some measure, the topic of suffering and preparing God's people to suffer well and to suffer with godly perspectives. But in chapter 1, verse 3, which we kind of looked at a few weeks ago, Peter begins with a burst of praise for the salvation blessings that we get in Jesus. And he starts to detail different facts about the salvation hope that we got birthed into when we believed in Jesus, and including how our hope gives meaning to seasons of suffering. But now we've reached a turning point in this first chapter in 1 Peter, because he's now moving us into what a worthy response to God's grace is going to mean for us. So, having told us what is true of our hope, he's now talking to us about what a true response to this hope is going to look like. And he gives us kind of four primary commands to really help us live invested into our salvation hope. And the first command that he gives us, it's there in verse 13, and we discussed it last week, is to actually be hoping in this hope, and to put all our chips on this hope and rest the full weight of our confident expectation in this hope. And then he commands us to commit to a holy lifestyle, to be imitators of God's holiness with our own personal holiness. And then the third command is for today, and that is to do life down here in a God-fearing way. And then the fourth command will be for next Sunday, and that is to give ourselves to loving each other well. But those four appeals that he makes in verses 13 all the way through the end of the chapter are really about us living fully invested into this salvation grace that we've been given. So we're going to take up the third appeal this morning, and it's in verse 17. If you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without spot or blemish. So there it is. Conduct yourselves with fear. And conduct yourselves with fear as exiles. And that's a very interesting word that's meant to remind us of what our relationship to the world is as believers. That we are doing life down here as foreigners because our citizenship is in heaven. And our relationship to this world is that of stranger, that of sojourner, that of exile. It's the Bible's way of saying you don't belong here. And that this world in its present form is passing away, and you don't belong to this present age. Your true home is with the age to come that's coming with the coming of Christ. And so let's not get too cozy down here and acting like this place is where our true home is. And those who are waiting for their true home in the age to come are to give themselves to the fear of the Lord, to God-fearing conduct. And the fear of the Lord can be a confusing topic, I think, for a lot of people. In fact, the fear of the Lord just the word fear sounds almost anti-hopeful, right? Because we tend to think of fear as a big negative or fear as a bad thing. But the Bible presents the fear of the Lord as a really positive thing. So I think the place to start with the fear of the Lord is to start with what the Bible doesn't mean by the fear of the Lord. And what the Bible doesn't mean by the fear of the Lord is this sort of keep away from God, I'm frightened by God kind of fear. A fear that leads one to not approach. There's sharks beyond the break line, so I'm not going to play in the surf. Fear. Or, I don't want to get COVID, so I'm not going to go to crowded places. Fear. Or, children, there's a high voltage wire that blew down in the road after that windstorm. Don't go near it kind of fear. Okay, let's just be real clear. That is not at all what the Bible means by the fear of the Lord. And so we're going to build an understanding on what the fear of the Lord is for the believer. And what I want to do is I want to set kind of a general baseline starting point for the fear of the Lord and then use this passage in Peter to actually build two more layers of understanding to it. So let's just set a general baseline starting block for the fear of the Lord. Part of the fear of the Lord includes this awareness that God has all the power to save and to destroy. James chapter 4 says there is one lawgiver and judge who is able both to save and to destroy. And if God has all the power to do one and God has all the power to do the other, then the wise thing to do is to pay attention to what God has to say to you. Because it's dangerous to trivialize God with your life. It's dangerous to minimize God's importance in your life. Like we would be foolish to not take seriously what God has to say, foolish to neglect Him, foolish to set our lives contrary to Him. So I think the fear of the Lord, ground zero, starts there. But that's not the whole story. And in fact, as we look at verse 17, we're going to see Peter give us some other aspects to the fear of the Lord for the believer. Because if you look closely at this verse, you'll see that Peter bases the need to fear God on two things. There's two things that he mentions in this passage that is supposed to sustain the fear of the Lord in our lives, to actually hold it in place, to keep it there. All right, and number one is the expectation of future judgment. Isn't that what he says? If you call on Him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves in fear. So the expectation of future judgment, that we will all stand before the judgment seat of Jesus, and each one will give an account of himself or herself to God, that God holds us accountable for every deed that is done in the body, and we are answerable to him for all of it. The believer's work will be tested in a time of future judgment at the judgment seat of Christ. There is a judgment the believer is going to go through. Now, this is not a judgment of eternal condemnation. Okay, a Jesus-loving, Jesus-following believer is not meant to live with anxiety about Christ possibly casting them away and shutting them outside of his kingdom forever. In fact, Jesus makes quite the opposite promise to us, that whoever comes to me, he says, I will never cast away, but rather I will raise him up on that last day. And so for the believer who takes Jesus seriously, the fear of the Lord is not the fear of damnation. It's just living mindful of your accountability to God for a future day of judgment, when the believer's work will be tested and it will be held up to the searching gaze and scrutiny of God and revealed for what it really was or wasn't. And there will be personal gain, and there will be personal loss on that day, and there can be honor, and there can be shame based on that judgment. And that judgment will factor into our eternal experience in the heavenly kingdom of Christ. And some of our works will carry over with eternal significance because they were done in Christ. And some of our works may be burned up and be seen to be worthless. But that judgment day for the believer is coming. And so what is the fear of the Lord? The fear of the Lord is living mindful as a believer of your accountability to God in that future day of judgment, where that can be a day of rewards and or a day of loss. And don't we do better when we're accountable? Accountability is not a bad word. Like, we actually just, accountability raises our game down here. We just function and flourish better when we know we're accountable to someone else. You know, if I was to go to Sportsman's Warehouse, and this could happen, and I was to just, on impulse, buy $5,000 worth of ice fishing gear, I would fear Dana. Like, I would. Like, how's that conversation going to go? How am I going to explain this one? I am not looking forward to the next few nights of unpleasant fellowship in the Martin household, right? I would have the fear of Dana going on as I'm driving this truckload of stuff home, right? Because we're accountable. Husbands and wives are accountable, and we share, right, our finances together. And the point that Peter really stresses right there at the top of verse 17 is this judgment is going to be based on an impartial standard. There's not going to be a double standard on that day. God's not going to have this like permissive, wink, wink, super chill, lax standard for the believer and then this really high bar for the unbeliever. It doesn't work that way. God is one God who will always be true to his character. Whether you're his kid, or whether you're not his kid, or whether you falsely claim to be his kid, God can never contradict who he is. He will never deny his justice, his moral goodness, his love. So he's going to judge believers and unbelievers with an impartial standard. And so just because you call on him as Father, and you have a right in Christ to call God your Father, but your right to call him Father is not your right to sin. because your Father is also an impartial judge who cannot contradict his own holy character in how he judges and assesses lives. And so there's this danger, right, that we could think, well, because I'm family, God's my Abba Daddy, and I'm his beloved kid, and so because I'm family, I can get away with some things now. That's never been my experience. My experience is Christians tend to get caught the fastest because they're family. Right? Because I'm family, God's going to look the other way now. Because I'm family, God's going to just be soft on my spiritual nonsense, or he's going to be okay with my sin now. We're family. He's my Abba Daddy, and I'm his kids. And Peter says, no, don't be deceived into thinking that. He is an impartial judge, and it's going to be the same standard of worthy and unworthy and right and wrong and true and false for everyone. When Ravi Zacharias, and a lot of you know who Ravi Zacharias is, he passed away in the spring of 2020. I think it was May of 2020. And he was one of the leading evangelical, world-renowned apologists. And by apologist, I mean a very brilliant defender of the Christian faith, prolific writer, prolific author, sought-after speaker, had a world stage audience. And there was a lot of people that looked to Ravi Zacharias as sort of a hero and champion of the faith. And when he died and they held his funeral, he was celebrated as a hero and champion of the faith. Just a man that had a very brilliant mind and way with words to sort of hold up the credibility and truthfulness of the Christian faith in the marketplace of all these other religious ideas. He's really good at that. How many of you have read his books? Right? Yeah, there's a few hands that have gone up. Well, then after his death and after his funeral, some things came to light that nobody saw coming. And they came to light about this double life, this secret life that he had been living, of a life of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct toward and with all these massage therapists around the world, as well as in the country. And overnight, he went from, that hit the headlines, and overnight he went from spiritual hero to spiritual zero. And it shocked the Christian community, it shocked his own family. And just investigations just revealed so many dimensions of his deviancy. It was just hard to get your mind around it. And I remember thinking, God, really? Couldn't you have just dealt with that one in a corner? Just have a you and Ravi moment in a corner. Why did you have to allow this to just come out into the open and be exposed on a world stage and just let his shame be plastered all across the planet? Because all you're doing, God, is arming your critics with that much more ammunition that they use to attack Christians and discredit the gospel. You're just giving your enemies, fodder for their cannon fire, right? So, it would have been so much better for your name, God, had you just dealt with this in a little quiet corner instead of letting this just be spilt out in front of everyone. And I was kind of lamenting that in my Friday morning men's group, and one of the guys just piped up and said, yeah, but God cannot deny his character. God can only and always be true to his character. He's not going to deny his justice, his standard of love, his standard of moral goodness. He's an impartial judge. Whether you're his kid, whether you're not his kid, whether you falsely claim to be his kid, This is who we have as our Heavenly Father. And it's meant to bring the fear of the Lord to our lives. There's a second thing, though, that Peter bases the fear of the Lord in. And you'll see that on the other side of verse 17. Knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. So the second thing he bases the fear of the Lord in is the super expense of our salvation. Like us meditating on the high cost of God's grace is meant to move us into a holy lifestyle. Like when you look at what it cost God to free us from the destructive force of sin and how it came at the price of his own dear Son, and that heaven gave the most precious thing heaven could ever possibly give. Like that is meant to sustain the fear of the Lord in our lives, because we don't want to insult that spirit of grace by living reckless and irresponsible and careless in our walk with God. Because when we look to God like we're very unappreciative of the high cost of our salvation. Like we're wasting that grace, and we're not using that grace to move our lives into the full measure of life change that's possible through that grace. We're not using that grace to escape the corruption of our former sinful desires. But we're squandering the super expense of our salvation, almost like we're receiving it in vain. And we want to fear. Like you should fear, acting like that's not worth much to you. That what cost God so much really isn't worth all that much to you, because we're being careless in our walk, we're being sloppy in our spiritual life, and just deviant in our devotion to Him. To God we look disregarding of the high cost of our salvation when we're walking that way. And Peter compares the costliness of Christ's blood to the most costly things that we can think of down here, like silver and gold. Things that can actually do a lot of things for you. You can do a lot with silver and gold, can't you? You can fix up your house super nice with silver and gold. You can pay for elective surgeries that most people can't afford with silver and gold. Take trips to far-off exotic places. You can send your kids to the very best schools. Purchase homes in highly coveted neighborhoods. Buy the best brands of clothing so you look like a high-ender. But you know, there's no sum of silver and gold that can purchase eternal life. In regards to buying eternal life, it's not precious, it's worthless. What's precious is the blood of Jesus. And what does he say about that blood? Like that of a lamb without blemish or spot, and foreknown before the foundation of the world. You know, Peter's language is drawing upon some Old Testament background of the system of animal sacrifice based in the Old Covenant temple to help us appreciate the preciousness of this blood. So what makes it precious? Well, for one, it's sinless blood, right? Without spot or blemish. It's blood that bled from a pure and perfect life. A life that was lived in perfect conformity to God's law, pristine from start to finish. And he says, like that of a lamb, right, offered on the altar at the temple. That it's precious because it's sacrificial. It was freely surrendered for the sake of somebody else in love. And it's precious because it fulfills the spiritual meaning of the sacrificial system in the Old Covenant. It's the prophetic fulfillment of how all those animal sacrifices anticipated the once and for all sacrifice of God's Son, and how that sacrifice purifies the worshiper and perfects the worshiper's ability to draw near to God boldly in acceptability. And it's precious because it was eternally planned for, right? Foreknown before the foundation of the world, that God prepared Christ as the payment for our sins before this world ever was. Right? We should never think of the cross as God's emergency plan that he threw into place after we sinned. That God ordained his Son to die for us before there was ever an us to die for. So he was foreseen, and he was foreknown, and then he appeared on the stages of history to put it all into effect. And notice how Peter frames what this precious blood actually redeems us from. He says you were ransomed from a worthless way of life that was handed down to you by your ancestors. You can think of the sort of the effects of generational alienation from God in one's family of origins, the sinful ways of your ancestors. You know, and those kinds of dark legacies, they can take different forms, can't they? They could be false deities that a family system was devoted to. It could be chains of addiction, right, that stretch way back. You know, dad was an alcoholic who was the son of an alcoholic who was the son of an alcoholic, right? There's those very common themes that tend to run through certain legacies. It can be legacies of generational divorce, lots of relational chaos, and live-in partners in and out of the home, what that does to the children in the home. It can be cycles of abuse that get repeated. You know, it was interesting when Dana and I were training, doing kind of the mandated training for foster care, one of the things they said was how cyclical foster care is, that these kids who grow up in the foster system are often become the parents whose kids are taken from them and placed in foster care. Right? It's that generational cycle going on. It could be dark family secrets that controlled you and kept you in fear. All the lies that the bad baggage of family brokenness writes on our hearts, that somehow the destructive behaviors of another person are my fault. Or I'm only as lovable as my achievements. Or I guess this is what normal behavior is, and so I guess I'm just to expect this and be okay with this in others. Or feelings of worthlessness and unwantedness. In Christ, you are not named by those things. He ransomed you from being defined by those things. And when His grace claimed you, His grace renamed you. And you can come out of those patterns and you can go into the healing light of Jesus and take on a new way of things in Him. Because now you're not a part of those old dark legacies. You're now a member of Jesus' legacy. You're a member of His family, of His lineage that extends from Himself as the second Adam and the new humanity that is headed up in Him and recreated in Him. That's your legacy now. And you have been redeemed from those old dark legacies. But you know, it costs God a lot to get you out of that legacy and into Jesus' legacy. And we want to walk it out down here, revealing a healthy respect for what it costs God to do that. and to live holy lives and to look carefully to how we walk, not as unwise, but as wise, so that it doesn't appear to God that we're just receiving his grace to no effect and we're wasting it, and it's like it's all in vain. And we're not letting it move us into all that life transformation it was meant to move us into. That's meant to bring the fear of the Lord to our lives. And the other thing that we covered that was meant to bring the fear of the Lord to our lives is the expectation of future judgment. And to live mindful of our accountability to God as an impartial judge who will test our work, every deed done in the body.